So, Sanjay, welcome to the Leadermorphosis podcast. Thank you for being here.
And thank you, Lisa, for inviting me. I'm very honored to be here.
Yeah. Well, we were talking about how to start this conversation before I started recording, and you had a really nice idea, I thought, about what you've been thinking about regarding kind of self-organized groups and organizations and why that's relevant for the kind of work you're doing. So, do you want to kick us off?
Okay. Um, so I was thinking all this week, basically, on your questions and the reason why we're talking about this. And I think maybe what uh, the starting point for me personally is realizing that we are all being educated to kind of obey, to follow instructions, and to do what others who have always wanted to control us want us to do. No, so l- life as humanity is the story of power and the story of control. And what is very interesting is how we're taught into that system since we're very small. No, and so we're taught into it from our parents because they learned it from their parents, but then it's really formalized in the schooling system. No, and in the schooling system is where it really starts being like, you're here to learn this, which we think that you need to know, to do this, to ask for permission, to be quiet, to don't make noise, don't bother your neighbor. No, the schooling system is a system of control in which we're all trained into being obedient, into being dependent, no, dependent on who else is going to tell us what else to do. And it's also very interesting how what it makes us is it kind of numbs our curiosity and our creativity. No, so I have a 4-year-old, and this 4-year-old asks questions constantly. No? And everything is a question. And my 10-year-old used to be like that when he was 4 years old, but in the schooling system, he has stopped asking me questions. I don't think he doesn't ask the question. I just think he stops asking them to me. No, it's like there's this thing. And it's interesting because I think nobody really finishes with the questions thing, but some people do numb them out. And then if you think about it, when you continue in the education process and then go into work life, well, in work life, it becomes even more accentuated because there you're really dealing with power. No, it's who's the boss, who has the money, who gives you jobs, who sustains you. And I think that's where you realize, okay, I will obey because I need to survive, I need to sustain a family or whatever. And so, what is interesting about this is that I feel this is like the essence of why I do what I do, but also why we are talking. You and I, basically, we're thinking there is this thing of how we are willingly and in an organized way giving up our autonomy, our liberty, our freedom of choice. Although we always think that the argument behind our humanity is freedom, no, and so I think it's a funny contradiction that's happening.
Yeah, that's so true. There's a great quote that freedom can't be taken away, it can only be forgotten. And I think that's so true. Like we have that curiosity when we're young, and it's sort of trained out of us, right?
Yeah.
And I'm so interested in this topic because I really think we can't reinvent organizations if we don't also reinvent schools and reinvent education, because otherwise, there's just so much unlearning that people have to do. Let's say even we get to a utopia where we reimagine organizations and they're so much more self-managed and decentralized. Even then, the education system is not designed that way.
and and it's weird because we kind of don't want it to be reimagined. We talk about it being reimagined. No, I've heard the story of transforming education for decades, not and I always hear the same story and I always hear the same things, but it's like there is a true sort of thing behind it, and it's like, would you let your kids learn in a different way as you learned? And everybody's going to say, obviously, yes, I want a new alternative. But when they're actually at it, you think, wait, are they really learning? Or is this really happening? No, there's always this thing of letting others do something that you haven't done and trusting that it's also a possible way of living. So it's not to judge that there's like an evil force behind everything. maybe there is, and I'm just an optimist. But in general, it's that the way of organizing, it's easier to go through the world of what we do know than what we don't know, obviously. And I think that's basically the reason why we end up reproducing these systems. So it's like better to have the dictator that you do know than not have a dictator thinking that you might get one or something like that. So I think it's people's fear of trying something new, which really like stops them from allowing themselves to live to their potential and to be no to live well, to live happy together.
Yeah. I maybe let's get into your story a bit. So I know you have this passion of obviously seeing, seeing the way it is and thinking, that can't be it and surely there's another way. So how do you come across souls, and we'll talk about what that means in a moment, and how did you start doing this work?
Okay, I can go really far back, and maybe I will, because it's funny that I was telling you the story the other day that my mom gave me like a poem I wrote when I was 12 years old, and I don't like poetry. So I was shocked that I wrote poems. And it was a poem which spoke, it was this poem called Life, and it was about my awareness as a kid, as a 12-year-old, of my privilege and the inequalities in which we live.
Wow.
And when my mom showed me that, I was like, she showed it to me like 2 years ago. She had it like in a drawer or something. And she said, "Look what I found." And I was like, "Oh my God, I've been talking about the same thing all my life. All my life, I've been concerned with inequality, with why some people live well and others don't. And maybe that's why I love art and I love biology and all that, but I ended up studying economics. And I ended up studying economics because it was one of the only things I really didn't know anything about, and I knew that it had a very important thing to do in our lives. No, it was like a central part of our life. And I fought with all my economics teachers because I hated orthodox economics. But at the same time, I discovered I also loved it because it was a big explanation of why we are where we are and why we accept this way of being together. It's all based on beliefs. And so I've always liked teaching. I've always been kind of a teacher, and I got into education just as I graduated. I also studied arts, and I worked in the public sector, and there's where I saw like big organizations. Not the public sector is the
Mm.
state, and that's like the biggest organization, and seeing how things had good intentions, but they would get stuck in bureaucracies, and they would get stuck in no, that can't be done. Phrases like that. No, no, no. That, yeah, that's a really good idea. No, but we can't do that. And there's always a that can't be done, and it's like, but we made this whole system up. What means we can't? Why can't we do it? If we just did it this way, why can't we do it another way? And after that, I always had this question. So I became a teacher for teachers at schools. And for me, art was the tool to sort of liberate creativity, freedom, everything. No, for me, it was like you have to learn maths, you have to learn language. But when you're talking about art, there isn't any have tos. No, there's no have tos. And so there's where really that was for me like the opportunity and the space for anybody to be able to like express yourself and communicate and create. No, and I was always thinking as kids, I've always loved painting, drawing, sculpting, stuff like that, and making music. And I always thought this is the way we're going to sort of affect the system, so that not nudge the system. It's let people be creative, and art is a tool. And in any case, I'm an economist, so I worked as an economist in the culture sector and education sector and something like that. Eventually, I said, whatever, I want to go and do whatever I want. With my partner, we said, let's go and do whatever we want to. And we actually went to Barcelona, and we went to study. I went to learn how to make electronic music because that's what I really wanted to do. And she went to learn how to sew and to make clothing. And there we got a scholarship to study interaction design. And so I became an interaction designer. And my thesis for my master's was a project of art, education, and technology. And my whole idea behind this project was that in Colombia, the government had spent tons of money putting computers in schools, and nobody used those computers. The teacher, sorry,
It's okay.
shall I? mm, I'm going to mute my phone, and you can cut this part off. Sorry. Basic sort of recording things. Did you turn off? Did you silence your phone? I didn't. I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
So, uh, my thesis for my master's was a project in education, art, and technology. And basically, what had happened is that the government had put computers in schools all over the country, and those computers were all locked up in closets, and nobody used them because the teachers were afraid that the kids would spoil them, and the teachers didn't know how to use. Well, they weren't interested in using. They know how to give their class without a computer. Why would they do it with a computer? And I thought, that's awesome because what we can do is we can put free software on them, and kids can start to make music and videos and animation and stuff using those. No, because it's tough for you to have a piano, but almost everybody has access to some digital device and you can make music on a computer. And so that was my whole idea behind this project. And I started to move it around here. And at the same time, I was a consultant for the ICT ministry, and I was developing a strategy to promote digital culture. And it's funny because everything all connected into understanding how to let people create on their own, having the tools that exist, which are much easily accessible. No, today having a smartphone is not so difficult, and it's really powerful because it can be an equalizing sort of tool. It can also, obviously, as it is right now, it can be a wonderful tool of control, of surveillance. But it's interesting because it was this possibility of allowing people to create. And if people created, no matter if they were rich or poor or whatever, creation is like what makes us human and what makes us feel like life is worth something when we create something. So, this project, I started offering it into the education world, and I realized, of course, I've come from an education world of privilege, but the education world of norm, like the majority of people, has so many other things which are like uh, barriers to having this experience. And that is when a couple of friends of mine told me, "Hey, you're moving your project. We're moving another thing that's called SOLEs." And I said, "Oh, what's that?" And he said, "No, this guy, this Indian guy, Sugata Mitra, just won a TED Prize. And he does this thing which is called self-organized learning. Why don't we try and move this? Would you be interested?" And I said, "Cool. It sounds like it was connected." And when I actually saw his TED talk, that's when I realized, wow, this is what I would needed as a opening, like as the gateway for my project of education, art, and technology. And I said, this is an idea of allowing people to learn how to learn in groups using the internet. So that's how I got to where I am today. Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah.
I'm a parent. I have two kids, live in Colombia, in Bogota. Maybe that's and my parents are foreigners, so I think maybe that would also add a little bit more to my life experience. I've always kind of been an outsider.
Mm.
My parents being foreigners has allowed me to sort of see the Colombian life as a Colombian, but also as an outsider.
Mm.
And I think I've always been I've been part of many groups, but I've always been kind of the outsider and insider. And that is where I realized in this system of inequality and discrimination, my role is kind of like being a bridge to
Mm.
allow those that feel outside feel like they're inside, and those that are inside allow the ones who are outside, so that there is no outside and inside, basically. And that's what I think I'm good at, because I can jump from one side to the other and say, hey, why don't we talk about this? Why don't you meet this person, etc., etc. So yeah.
Mm. I love that. So, I remember watching Sugata Mitra's talk maybe about 10 years ago, maybe a bit less than that, and being so inspired um, as well. I remember telling everyone I bumped into him, you have to watch this is incredible. Um, so tell us, what is a soul? What are the kind of principles of a soul?
Okay. So SOLE stands for a self-organized learning environment, and basically a SOLE is a space, it's a physical space where you have people, groups of people, 10, 15, 20 people, less computers than people, usually one computer every four or five participants, with internet connection, and something called big questions. And we call them big questions because they're interesting questions, difficult questions, engaging questions, something which is in the interest of all the people in SOLE. So what happens in a SOLE basically is that people self-organize using the information on the internet and their peers to find answers to those questions. So nobody's teaching. There is no teacher. Nobody's there teaching any topic. It's because of people's curiosity that they learn. And more interesting than the answers that they find to those questions is that new questions arise. No, so you can ask yourself, why do things fall down? And you say, because of gravity. No, you go into Google, why do things fall down? Oh, because of gravity. And you can say, okay, what is gravity? Oh no. And you go into Google again, what is gravity? And then you find, oh, gravity is a magnetic force that the Earth produces. And you say, okay, why does the Earth produce a magnetic force? And the whole point is that it's an iterative process which allows you to deepen the learning, because one question takes you to another one. And that's how the learning process really becomes deeper. And that's the emergent experience of the self-organized learning environment, is that people learn. But not only do they learn about the topics that the questions are about, but they also learn the basic skills which everybody says we need nowadays. No, so I've seen all these uh, TED talks and coachings and things that everybody says the skills that you need for nowadays are to be able to collaborate, to be able to communicate with others. That you have to be creative and innovative, and you have to have critical thinking, and you have to be able to self-direct yourself and have initiative and stuff like that. Well, all those skills are the ones that you develop in a soul,
Mm.
basically. And they develop because as you have to collaborate with others, you have to find information and know how to judge it. It's more, it's like being self-taught, but being self-taught in groups, which is one, more fun, easier to do. No, because to be self-taught you have to have a lot of discipline, but it also develops all these other social skills, which are the important skills for trying to tackle any uncertain reality, which we have many nowadays. So that's basically what happens in a soul.
Mm. It's amazing. I remember some of the examples that Sugata gave also of, because I think a lot of people must be skeptical. It's like what you were saying at the top of the conversation. Like people think, oh yeah, reimagining education, that's a good idea. But when you talk about this, I imagine a lot of people must say, wait, but no teachers? I mean, no, come on, like they're just going to mess around on the internet. Like that's not going to work. But it's proven, right? And you must have some amazing stories of the difference that it's made, especially in terms of this kind of dimension of inequality.
Yes. So I have tons of stories, but okay, we have to understand this is like scientifically proven. No, this is what Sugata Mitra has been spent the last 2 3 decades researching, and basically his findings are kids can learn almost anything in a self-organized learning environment, which is interesting in itself, because what it does is it does put out the question of, so what are teachers for? And it's a very interesting, because it does make you realize that it's different to talk about teaching than to talk about learning. And nowadays I don't like the word education anymore, because education has all these connotations of a way of learning. And now that's why I talk about learning in a different sense, because what the whole point behind souls is that people learn how to learn, and they do it together. And it doesn't mean that teachers are not important. I always think you need, teachers are still very important, but the thing, it's very different at what they would have to do now in the age of internet than what they used to do before they were the sources of information. Now the sources of information are online, right? What you need now from a teachers is the role of somebody who can motivate you, who can inspire you, who can actually tell you a story which makes you want to be interested in something you have absolutely no knowledge about. And that's the role of a teacher. No, because obviously I am not going to go and research about trigonometry on my own. No, it's like trigonometry. No, it's not like I'm interested in sines and cosines and tangents just out of nowhere. But if my teacher tells me or asks me a question like, how does your phone know where it is? And I think, that's an interesting question. Okay. And then I go on Google it and it says, no, there are like three satellites here and there. And and they're talking to the phone. And maybe I ask myself, well, what are they telling the phone? They're talking to the phone in sines and cosine tangents, and that's how I get interested in trigonometry. And so it's interesting because it's really changing, like flipping the concept of education to learning. And in that sense, uh, I don't know if you know, but public education in Colombia is not awesome, as probably in most parts of the world.
Mhm.
And I'm very glad it exists, and it's very important because otherwise kids would have very scarce opportunities. So for example, in Colombia, public education is universal. Everybody goes to school. What is true is also that teachers have a really tough job because they
Mm.
have to be teachers, they have to be their parents, no? They come from tough backgrounds and so on and so forth. So really, this is nothing against the public education system and the teachers in itself. This is about the possibilities that they could have with this learning. The other thing is that here in Colombia, what we started to do was so Sugata Mitra has never been able to work with a government. No, he's tried in India and in England, where he's a professor in a university. And but here in Colombia, we managed to convince the government to do so at a large scale with the government because basically there was a very clear need. The government had already spent a ton of money putting computers and internet in public spaces, and nobody was using them. So they were in public schools, they were in public libraries, and there were internet kiosks in remote rural areas. So it was really cool because they were giving access to the internet, but people didn't know what the internet was or
Mm.
what it was about. And we're talking about this is 2013,
Mm.
2014. And so we said, well, we have a very simple and very powerful methodology which allows people to start exploring the internet for probably the most basic thing you need as a human is to be able to find answers to questions. And so that is how we started off. And so we have tons of stories of how this happened because basically Sugata invented this to be done with kids, no, for the schooling experience, for the learning in schooling experience. Instead, as we went to public spaces, kids went with their parents, with their grandparents, in the public library. So we started doing souls with all ages and mixed stages and mixed groups. And what was very interesting is that it became a space for getting people to be curious again, allowing themselves to be curious again, allowing themselves to ask questions. And so the first thing we do when we do a first soul session in a new community is we ask people, what are three questions you've always had and never been able to answer?
Hmm.
So if I ask you, I'd like you to think about it. But generally, what happens is that us as adults, it takes us time. And we who have been educated and probably have uh, higher education and probably maybe postgraduate education or something like that, our questions are all super elaborate. But kids come up with tons of fantastic questions really quickly. They have them super clear. And what's interesting is that when adults see that kids have these questions, they allow themselves to have these questions that they have as kids. So I don't know if you already have a question which you have always had and never been able to answer in mind.
It's really hard actually. So you're so right. I'm like, oh no, think of a good question. Think of something clever.
So that's the thing. You're always thinking of if I have a question that I need it to be a clever one because I'm not going to say a stupid question. And
Mm.
so the first thing we tell people is there are no stupid questions. All questions are good questions. Some questions are more complex than others, but doesn't mean. But every question counts. And what is interesting is that when I'm at this point with adults, I always ask them, think of when you were a kid. what was a question that you had as a kid which never got answered? Maybe it's still there. And that's when people start remembering. Ah, yes, I always wanted to know, I don't know, why the sky is blue. So, do you know why the sky is blue, Lisa?
Oh, I think it's something to do with the ocean and reflections, but I can't remember.
Okay, so this is cool because what happens is when a question comes out, and usually I never pose a question like the one I just gave you as an example. I just let people in silence. Everybody gets kind of, adults get kind of stressed. The kids are like 5 seconds, and they have like 10 questions. They show them, and you're like, and what happens is that in the process of people sharing their questions with one another, they always end up, ah, yes, I have a question about, and they listen to the other one's question. Ah, yes, I love this. And they start putting out questions which are really honest, powerful questions, and very, many of them are scientific, but like one of the most common questions in 9 years of doing this that I've always heard is, does God exist?
Mm,
And the other most common question is there life on other planets?
mm,
Which is, they're very powerful questions and they're very interesting. And so what's interesting about the soul is that what we're looking for is for people to answer questions which they find interesting.
mm.
So usually when we tell people what are their questions, I take note of all of them and then I say which is the one you like the most. And we go for that one because if everybody's interested in that, that means everybody's going to be engaged in the self-organizing process. Having said that, I have many examples, but just to give you three, I have one teacher in Cartagena who started using Soul to teach her classes of political science. And her interest was that her kids became active citizens, no? Like
Mm.
that was her interest. So one day she goes into her class and she says, we're going to do a thing called the soul. And the kids are like, what? And this is like, what questions do you have? And from the questions the kids started doing, they started learning this way. And after a time, they started asking all the other teachers of their other subjects. They said, we want to learn with you like we're learning with Maria. And the teachers all went to Maria and they said, what are you doing? And she said, I do souls. And they were like, well, tell us how you're doing this. And so what she says is, okay, this is how a soul session happens. And this is how they do it. And the teachers started doing souls for their own classes, no biology, math, and so on and so forth. And it turns out that the whole school started doing souls and the whole school started getting better results, both academically, but also better results in terms of the kids' self-esteem,
Mm.
their kids' attitudes. And they ended up writing a report to give to the Secretariat of Education of Cartagena saying, hey, you should put souls in all the schools. So, talk about active citizenship and participation. Well, that happened. And I need you to know we went one day for 4 hours to show Maria how to do souls.
Wow.
No? And that's where you say, okay, this is the power of self-organization. And it's like you cannot plan this. No, it's not like me going to the Secretariat of Education and saying, I have this wonderful innovative methodology that you should try in school because they're going to change, which is what everybody does. This is coming from the bottom. This is
Mm.
coming from a public school, a teacher who decides to you do something and moves, and the kids, they themselves are empowered and they move it, and that's where it goes. A different example is what happened in an indigenous community in northern part of Colombia. Uh, they had one of these internet kiosks that the government set up, and it's in a place called Boca de Camarones. And we showed the guy who was the administrator. He was 20 years old, just his first job, 3 months job. He was the guy who basically opened the internet kiosks and let people use the internet, right? So he's not a teacher, he's not an educator. His mind is not about like this is my long-term job, whatever. This is in 2015. We show him how to do this, and he starts working with his kids. He's from an indigenous community called the Wayu, and the Wayu teens and kids are not. He feels they weren't very identified with their culture. Why? Because they're close to Riohacha. Riohacha is like the big town, the big city of La Guajira, and that area there's a lot of uh, illegality happening. There's contraband, there's drug money, and so there's a lot of easy money, and so kids are only interested in going to Riohacha to get to make money easily. And so he asked them, "What are you guys interested?" And the kids say, no, well, we like video games and we like videos and we like animations and all that. And he says, well, why don't you learn how to make your own? And so they go into Google and then how do you make a video game? How do you make a video, etc., etc. And then they say, for any of those, you need to have a story. So they go back to our Soul ambassador, and he's called Elainer. And so they say, Elainer, where can we get a story? And he just throws the question back at them. I don't know, guys. Where can you get a story from? And they go like, we can talk to the elders of the community and get the YU stories. So these guys end up making video games, animations, and videos of the YU stories and putting them online. And this happened again. We went one day 4 hours to show Elainer how he could set up a soul in his internet kiosk, and it's just emerged. Well, this community has continued doing souls, not only to that level that in 2018 government changed and they closed down their internet kiosk, and since then we've been working with them to so that they could continue doing souls because they valued a lot this experience of using it as a way of preserving their culture but also for their learning, etc., etc. And they now know even the elders come to learn how to use the computers and what the internet is about. But it's very cool because they're talking with the kids, and no, they know stuff,
Mm.
they share what they know, but they're also finding stuff online. So it's a very interesting dialogue that's happening between their ancestral knowledge with well, the information they're finding online. And we've been trying to so they themselves wanted to keep this going, and that's when we said, okay, well, why don't we try and build a space for them to learn? And this is what we called the Soul Lab, which is for us what we call the library of the future. And imagine a place where you go in and there's nothing, but there's the internet. So there's everything. There's all the books in the world. There's all the information in the world, and it's all there. And you just need a reason to use it. And the reason is to answer big questions, to find a way to connect. And that's how, after 4 years of trying to get this done, finally last year we were able to get funding and set up the first Soul Lab, which we built in Boca de Camarones for this community. And you have to imagine, this is a 20-year-old kid. Now he's 27. Now he just had his first child a week ago, and now he's empowered his brother and other people of the community to be the sole ambassadors of that community. And now they're figuring out how to use the space not only for their educational purposes of kids to like do their homework, learn about stuff, but also to move their entrepreneurship projects, which are on ecotourism and stuff like that. So these are like two very different
Mm.
examples of how soul and self-organized learning can be adapted to so many contexts. We also use it for peace building in Colombia. You know, we have
Mm.
armed conflict, and it's really interesting how the internet, no, if you wait for, thanks to the peace agreement, there was supposed to be roads and new schools being built in these areas which had historically been isolated. And obviously our previous government didn't do anything about that. And so instead, having a little bit of internet, having a few devices, we've been able to set up souls in these areas, and people are just like, wow, so we can learn about this. I've always wanted to know how to cook. I've always wanted to know how to set up a business. I've always wanted to know how to fix this machine which they gave us and we've never been able to use. Stuff like that. And they're using their souls to do that.
That's amazing. I'm super inspired. I think what's so encouraging for me is that I've had this kind of side passion of studying different examples of like alternative schools and kind of educational models, but always it tends to be, okay, this is amazing, but it's a private school, right? And it takes a lot of resources. And whereas for me, what's so inspiring about souls and how you've been kind of unleashing them in Colombia is like how scalable it is and how kind of lean it is. It's really just a computer, an internet connection, a group of people, and then a soul ambassador, right? A person who can be encouraging. And is that the same role as the kind of grandmother figure, or is that different?
So that's another concept which goes with the soul concept.
Mm-hmm.
And so Sugata Mitra in his research, he found out something which you would think, well, this is kind of obvious, but it's important that somebody scientific says it. And it's that it's more important to have somebody uh, motivating in a learning process than somebody who's an expert. because you might have the best expert, but if he's a crappy teacher, well, who cares if he's an expert? No? In a learning process. No, I'm not saying experts are not important to get stuff, go deeper into our possibilities of knowledge, etc. But in a learning process, it's more important to have somebody who's motivating. So Mitra invented this idea and this concept of the granny. And he calls it a granny because my granny says, Sanjay, I really don't get what it is that you do, but tell me more. That's so cool. No, I don't really understand. But and a grandmother is somebody who's not an expert, but somebody who's warm and listens and encouraging and says, I don't know how to do it, but I'm sure you can figure it out. And is somebody who's there. And what Sugata Mitra discovers is that that accelerates learning processes dramatically. So he invented a thing called the Granny Cloud. And basically, the Granny Cloud is a network of volunteers, men and women of all ages. No, I'm also a granny. Whose role is to connect remotely to the souls and not teach, not be a teacher, be a granny. And that means listening and asking, okay, what are you guys finding out? And what is that? And wow, that's so cool. And how did you do that? And it's somebody who's there to motivate, but also to listen. And so this concept of the granny cloud is also a big part of what we do here in Colombia because it's also been a way of creating dialogue amongst people. No, we live in a country which is tough and which people have been silenced after decades of conflict and silenced like literally, but also silenced in the way that people feel like they're not capable of changing stuff. No, it's like whoever feels like they can want to move something for the good of the others always feels hindered by the government, the guerrilla, the paramilitaries, the drug lords. No, there are always all these forces or the elites, or which say even if you try and do it, you won't be able to. And so, what is very interesting is that when people feel heard and feel heard by somebody who they would normally not meet in their life, this is like jumping that super big barrier of class, which is very big here in Colombia, of race, which is hidden behind the class, which is hidden behind money, basically. So it's very interesting how being able to we've created a granny cloud, a Spanish-speaking granny cloud that connects to these different places around these souls that are happening all around the country. And it's very interesting because for people it's like an opportunity to be heard and to see a world very different to their own, and that goes both ways. No, it goes for the grannies and it goes for the communities which have souls. And it's a I think there is where there's real magic because, yeah, like the soul session is very cool because of the question. The granny cloud is very cool because of the listening and the dialogue. And I think that's what those two ingredients are really like an empowering tool, which is tremendous, no? Which is like where it goes to the next level of realizing what we're capable of, and where we realize, wow, we're capable of doing very amazing things like the two stories that I just told you. I have stories, tons of those, and that's because people do amazing things. So when you say it's a very simple methodology, it is very simple, but it takes very passionate people to actually make it work, because as there is as the simpleness is what it allows it to be scalable. But for it to really hold and to continue and to be iterated and become it, and for it to become a habit, needs people who believe in it and who make it work. So these Marias and these aligners, these are, I know they're everywhere. No, it's like Ratatouille, the movie of the mouse.
Yes.
It's like everyone can cook, everyone can be one of these ambassadors. It's just, they're not everywhere. You have to find, they emerge and you have to find them so that those processes can continue. So it's really a very non-linear process. It's a very sort of like emergent process, which I've been fascinated to experience.
What makes a good granny then?
So there are many ways of being a granny, and I think it's very different. No, there are these grannies which are like uh, elder women who are grannies probably in their real life also, and so they're super cozy. But then there's grannies like me who are like super energetic and that, and then there's other grannies who are very calm and quiet, but they're there and they don't know much what to say. So really what makes a granny is this honest and sincere intent of wanting to connect
Mm.
to others randomly and to support their learning processes by not wanting to control them, by basically
Mm.
allowing them to happen and accompanying. It's really somebody who's there to hold your hand and go through something. And so that's what makes a good granny, I think.
Mm. It's very similar to what makes a good coach. And it's interesting because I think coaching has a lot of connotations, and I don't mean coach as like a profession, but I think coaching as a way of being is a really valuable skill set to develop,
Yeah.
which is a lot of what you just said, you know, the ability to really listen to someone so they feel heard and seen, the ability to ask good questions kind of free from your own like agenda, or you know, the ability to hold back your advice or expertise.
So there is one big difference, and it has to do with the word. The word coach has a connotation of power, which a
Mm,
granny doesn't.
mm,
And it's very intentional for me. It's very powerful to understand. Like, no, because if you were, I've always thought of it like, what should be a teacher nowadays? A teacher nowadays should be a granny, not
mm,
not not a coach, because a coach is somebody who is still the person who knows, versus or not the person who knows, who has not, because you think of coaches like in sports, and you think of coaches, there is this idea of this is like the still somebody who's more expert than you, in a sense. Instead of granny, everybody has a granny, or normally has a granny, and it's somebody you do admire, but it's not because of their knowledge specifically. Obviously they do have tons of knowledge, our grannies, but the reason why you admire them, or why you relate to them, has a more human sensible touch than
mm,
that of like the coach, no. So I do think, no, like the word mentor also has a weight on it. Instead, the granny, I think, is like lovely because it's like people go without any sort of prejudice. No,
mm.
today we're going to connect with a granny. This is really cool, and they get rid of all the prejudice and the
Yeah.
expectations. It's like whatever can come up. This is really cool.
Mm.
This is enough.
Yeah, I get that. You've told me that you've also done souls in companies and organizations. How does that go?
So back in 2019, we started thinking that one of the big problems why this hasn't scaled in schooling worldwide is because that question which you ask, so what about teachers and what do we do now and does this really work, is a question which is very common worldwide. And the people who most commonly ask this are the parents of the kids who are going to school. And they say, what is this? What is this mess? What is this? Not this chaos. No, because a soul is a chaotic space. If you go into a soul when it's happening, it's noisy, it's messy, it looks very different to your average school no classroom. And so people say, are kids really learning? Is this no? I've had to have this conversation with ranging from my parents to people in the Ministry of Education, ranging to people in the corporate sector. And there is always this doubt because we weren't brought up in that. And we didn't have the internet when we were kids. So that's a very different world. And so allowing this freely, and obviously with all the horrible things that happen with the internet now, where people are even more sort of like
Mm,
resistant to letting this happen. And one of the things I do notice that is that it was very interesting was we need parents to be able to experience this as well. So we should go into their workplaces and let them live it, because if they live it, they're going to let their kids do this at school, and they're going to ask their teachers and they're going to ask the principals to say, hey, why don't you do this also? No, so you have all these organizations and things which are learning lean and all these new methodologies, design thinking, and all that. And we thought, well, if souls were in corporations and in organizations, probably that would allow this to move into the education world in another way, because there's always been a lot of resistance. No, we've gone into schools always kind of through the back door, no, because teachers find us. But when we try and go into the formal system top down, there's always this is a bit too scary for us to try. You try it first and you tell us if it works, and then we'll think about it. We won't even do it. Instead, if we went into organizations, this was happening. When we started to think about this, we started to research about how organizational learning happened, and we started having conversations with companies, and we realized, oh my God, not only does it make sense, but they need this, no? Because basically everybody's kind of stuck in their own little cubicle, in their silos. And I know the word silo because of talking to all these people, because the word silo seems to be something super common in the organizational world. And it's everybody lives isolated from each other, and they don't have spaces of learning. And learning is not, everybody learns by doing, but kind of out of stress and out of pressure and out of, no, the sense of competition. There's rarely sort of this idea of collaboration, or if there is this sense of collaboration, it's always like, let's go outside and let yourself drop into your partner and into your colleague's arms and show trust, and not all these activities, which I think are important. I'm not saying they're not, but it's like, how do we do that in the purpose of what we need to be doing? And so that's where we thought souls in organizations are a great, might be a good idea, might be a good experiment to try. And that's where we went to a couple of organizations. One we worked with is SAP, and another one we worked with is like a distributor of Google here in Colombia. And what we realized is that I did exactly the same thing. What are three questions you've always had and not been able to answer? And it's interesting because all the questions that come out about their work are things where the boss looks at the other at the employees like, really, you have that question? And that's where you realize employees are not allowed to ask questions. No, they're not allowed to. And then you realize the questions that the boss have are the same questions that their boss on top of them will look down upon as well. So it's very interesting because we did several soul sessions in which obviously there's this thing of, my question has to be more clever because I am the boss kind of thing. But it was also the boss realizing that amongst their teams, they're wonderful questions, and they're questions which can be better than theirs and which could make it grow. And what we realized doing these soul sessions is that they found it like a wonderful way of interacting and a much more productive way of getting things done than the actual methodologies or meetings that they with which they used to normally work. And they said, we've never had a conversation like this before. No, we've never had a conversation which is informed and in which we look for information online. Maybe it's information about us specifically, which is not maybe online, but in our archives or whatever. Or maybe it's information online which helps our work and which is also a part of ours. And that's what keeps us kind of going. And when we tested this, I said, cool, do you like this? This is something you could do? And they said, yes, but we need you to be here. And I was like, but what did I do? And they started saying, um, no, well, you asked us which questions we had. And I said, well, now you can ask yourselves, right? They were like, yeah. And then they asked us, but wait, no, like if you are not here, we won't be able to have these conversations. And I said, why? And it's interesting because, of course, the hierarchies in the self-organized learning environment disappear, no? But they do feel the need to have somebody external to allow themselves to do that. Because if there is nobody external, then this won't happen. And the other thing, which I found very interesting about this, was that this allowed organizations to really find the questions which are important for them, for their change, for their learning, for whatever, no? Because kind of these questions usually are thought of as coming from the top down. No? The ones on the top are the ones who have the good questions, which are going to change everything, which are going to transform. and they kind of, maybe that question comes, no, anyone can cook ratatouille. Maybe the question comes from someone else, and probably it will come from someone else, and probably it will come out from the process of working together in a soul that they will come out. So really what we found was this was a very powerful tool to allow organizations to find those questions which are really their big questions which change stuff, because learning to make questions is tough, and nobody can teach you how to make a question. You only learn to make a question by asking questions, no? And you go getting better at it because one question takes you to the other, and then you realize, if I would have asked a question like this, then I could go closer to the type of thing I think I'm looking for, that kind of thing. So in organizations, I see this is a very sort of necessary thing. And it's also one of these things that it's like, if you set up a soul no, imagine having a room in an office, which is the room where people say, okay, I have a problem, let's all get together, bring in whoever can from all these other divisions and whatever, and 20 people for 1 hour, we're going to try and answer this question, which one person has, who is interested, I am, and they would come into these spaces. Imagine what would happen with the organizations. No, it would be like, no, this talk of the learning organizations, and it's talk about, but it's like, how do you make that happen? Well,
Mm.
I think with souls within organizations that would happen. What is true is that I haven't been able to do this systematically in an organization, meaning throughout a long period. I've been able to do short experiences of 3-4 sessions in which they are like amazing, but then when they start thinking about, do they want to invest their money in this, they still think, no, it's better to hire an outside consultant to solve the problem for us. No, there is little trust in their own skills and abilities and teams to be able to solve these things. So
Mm.
that's one of those things where I think there's like a mental barrier there to solving these things.
Mm. How fascinating as well that the soul, there's something very revealing about like a microculture just by the nature of the kind of questions people ask, right?
I think you have to understand that self-organization is a phenomenon of like living systems, no? Self-organization, no? Scientists, the scientists of which are answering all the different difficult questions of humanity and of the universe and its existence, have found self-organization to be a process which is common and which is a process that brings to life things. So if you were to think about it in organizations, how do you want to have an organization that's alive? Well, you have to allow for self-organizing happening there. That's why I think you propose self-managed teams and stuff like that. No, that's how you bring life to an organism, which is this organization.
Yeah, that's a really nice way of putting it. Oh, I now I have to do the difficult job of trying to wrap up our conversation. What would you, for people listening who are thinking now, wow, how can I set up a soul in my school or in my organization, or what advice would you give them? What would you recommend?
Well, there's two ways of doing it. One is ask me. That's the easy one. That's the quicker one. It might be the quicker one. But another one, a very simple one, is to try it. And to try it, it's not, I'm saying it's simple because it's a simple methodology, but it's not simple in the sense that you need to have an energy to make this happen, and not like the initial energy, not like the big bang. You have to have big energy at the beginning to make this flow and create and happen. So there is a soul toolkit online in our website, which they you can download it and read it and see how you set up, and it's very simple, but it has like very key elements to take into consideration. But I do think that one of the things we are good at Soul Colombia is helping you figure out how you adapt soul to your needs and what needs to be done in your team, in your school, in whatever.
Mm.
For schooling, it's pretty simple. There's even an app that helps you plan your soul sessions that shows you how to do it. It's called Start Soul, and it's made by some colleagues of ours in the US. Uh, but I would say there's an interesting thing about really just trying to go and do this. So I would say experiment,
Mm.
but don't give up. You have to be patient. You have to do several sessions for it to feel like it's like you know where it can go or where it's going. So it's also allowing yourself to feel it openly.
Yeah, it's like the best way to learn it is by doing it, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
But I can also tell more stories, or we can
sure.
also advise people on how to get there. So I
Mm,
think that's important. I think the other big thing we're also and is worth mentioning is we've set up a like a network of communities who use souls, and
mm,
it's and like all these examples I've given you not because I've many personally lived them, because I show people how to do so, but I don't have a community with which I work every day doing souls. No, I'm not a teacher at a school. I don't have a like I do souls with my team, but we're a small team, and it's no this works with larger groups. Also, it works further. So it's interesting that this network, which we've created, which is called the SOLE Colombia community, is of ambassadors and grannies who share their experiences of what works, what doesn't work, what amazes everybody, what is exhilarating. And what I find it very interesting is that it's a self-organized community. No, because we're there to bring people together, but when we don't bring people together, people get together anyway. And that's what I think is very interesting. And it's because there's something about self-organization that allows them to kind of want to connect and make these things happen. So you can also participate from our Soul Colombia community, and that will be a good way to get in touch with other people who have tested this in other contexts. And I think that's very cool to learn about.
mm. Yeah, great. Thank you. Maybe to finish, a kind of maybe it's fitting for me to ask a big question to finish. What's your hope for the future?
Very big one. Um, so I could say the quick one is I hope we are able to transform this system in which we live in, which we invented, which is called capitalism, into something more human, not a system which sort of like spits most many of us out. And obviously, what I do feel is that a world where we are more connected and more and we get rid of all these prejudices and all these beliefs which keep us apart. I think that's my belief for the future. But in practical terms, I also wish that my kids get to see a different way of learning, a different way of living together because of what we're doing here. So I don't know if it's in the education system, learning in souls be much more common and be the way we would learn. Connecting to grannies and random people around the world in a way which is only allowed by the internet. Uh, I think that a world in which we all connected in different ways and people supported each other even if they don't know each other, I think is an opportunity which will make the world look different. And finally, what I do think is we have to be able to talk about these things and really get into them. And so, my world, my hope for the future is that everybody is not scared of asking questions and going off and looking for answers to them, but not doing it alone, doing it together. That would be. It's a very tough question you made. It's like.
Taste of your own medicine.
I know, I know. It's like I don't know if I want to taste it so often because it happens to me every day. It's like, no, brain cells. Thank you. I think it's an
Yeah.
awesome question to ask. What
Mm.
is your hope for the future?
Well, similar that I mean, that's also why I do this podcast. My hope is that by sharing stories and examples that people see something else is possible and those ideas spread and we reinvent the system that we're in and see that it is possible to reinvent it. We made it, we can unmake it.
Maybe I would add, I agree completely. And maybe one thing that is deep in me is the sense of urgency.
Mm.
I think, no, we need to do it quickly. No, it's like I don't want to have the boredom of being of one of those generations which says, okay, if we didn't do it, the next one will fix it. No, I don't want to leave it to the next generation to fix, and I don't want to leave it to the next. I think we're in an age and in a moment of level of connection in which we're the ones who are doing it, and we can do it, and it can be done. And I really believe that. No, I know everybody's always scared of climate change and world conflict and all these things, and you're like, yeah, that's the world we're in. But I also think this is a very interesting moment to live, and this is a very interesting moment where no, I've taken souls to over 450,000 people have participated from souls. I don't even know who these people are, and you say it's interesting because we're so many that the this is like the first time in history that the experience of masses and mass transformation, well, this has never happened in the history of humanity, no. And I think there's an interesting point where it's possible to switch things, change stories, and and no, change ways of living, so we can all live better together. So yeah, we have to do it now, quickly.
Yes. My colleague Vera likes to say, we're the ones we've been waiting for.
That's a very good phrase. We're the ones we've been waiting for. I hope so. I believe it. No, I don't hope. I believe
Mm.
it.
Oh, Sanjay, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. The time flew for me, and I'm so happy that you shared your story. I'm so happy that you're doing this work in the world. It's important work, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you for allowing me to have a speaker, speakerphone to be able to share it. I'm very happy. Thank you for your questions, and I am honored to be in this space. No, there, it's very cool to be able to tell the story.